Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program, Conservation Stories, Shedd Aquarium's Freshwater Research. My name is Alex Galassini, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Engagement at the Chicago Council on Science and Technology. We'd like to start this program by thanking our partners who help support this program. This evening's presentation of Conservation Stories is made possible in part by the Joel M. Friedman, President of Alvin H. Baum Family Fund, which supports science, technology, and environment programming, including C2ST's environmental programming series. We'd also like to thank Shedd Aquarium for both providing speakers and for helping promote this program. Shedd Aquarium's mission is sparking compassion, curiosity, and conservation for the aquatic animal world, and we certainly think our four speakers today are going to help with that. We'd also like to thank Friends of the Chicago River for promoting this program. Since 1979, Friends of the Chicago River has been working to improve the health of the Chicago River system for the benefit of the people, plants, and animals. Visit chicagoriver.org to access their new nature program and podcast, Inside Out and About, which is available on Spotify. If this is your first time joining C2ST for a program, we are a 13-year-old not-for-profit organization who's dedicated to advancing science and technology within the city of Chicago and beyond. If you're interested in donating to C2ST, please visit our website so you can help support programs just like this in the future. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's program. First, we have Dr. Karen Murchie, who's the Director of Freshwater Research, whose work focuses on how environmental change and human activities affect native migratory fishes. Dr. Austin Happel's research focus is to better conserve, manage, and restore freshwater ecosystems, including our very own Chicago River. Dr. Kentaro Inoue studies freshwater mussels, which are one of the most endangered animal groups in the world, but nonetheless provide key services to the ecosystems they live in. And last but not least, we have Dr. Melissa Youngquist, who works with Shedd's Conservation Action Team, as well as the Forest Preserve District of Cook County, in order to restore wetland habitats for local amphibians and other animals. If you're interested in asking questions of any of our speakers during this program, or reading a little bit more about them, please visit c2st2.cnf.io. You can type your questions there, or click the Speaker Profiles button to learn a little bit more about our speakers. Without further ado, though, I'd like to have them start presenting on the topic that you're all here to learn about, Shedd Aquarium's freshwater conservation research. Karen, we'd like to start with you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Alex, for having us join in the C2ST conversation today. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity for us to be able to share some of Shedd Aquarium's local freshwater research. And we'll just get right into it. We all rely on freshwater every day, from bathing to drinking, and it is an absolutely very precious natural resource. And we are so lucky right here in the city of Chicago to be surrounded by freshwater, from being situated right on one of the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, to the iconic Chicago River. These waterways are absolutely woven into the history of the city. And beyond Lake Michigan and the Chicago River, there's so many different tributaries, large and small, rivers and creeks, as well as lots of wetlands that are surrounding the city in the greater Chicago area. And all of these aquatic ecosystems are full of diverse aquatic life that are all making a living right here in our backyard. And really, despite being surrounded by all of these amazing habitats, we often don't appreciate the number of direct threats that human activities impose on these systems, nor how intertwined our health and well-being is with theirs. And it's definitely not a problem that's confined to our own backyard right here in Chicago, but it's something that's common across the globe. And actually, just within the last 24 hours, the World Wildlife Federation had dropped a report that talks about freshwater systems and the forgotten freshwater fisheries that are there. It's something that really matters across the globe. So this is really why we're here today, to get into learning more about our freshwater systems right here in our backyard and some of the local research. So it's my pleasure to introduce further, for anyone that just joined in, the freshwater team at Shedd Aquarium, and we'll discuss all the different types of innovative ways that we're working with various partners to address the different threats to our freshwater environment and the animals that call them home. You'll hear from Dr. Austin Happel, our urban aquatic ecosystems biologist, Dr. Kentaro Inoue, our freshwater mussel specialist, and Dr. Melissa Youngquist, our amphibian habitat restoration biologist. And of course, myself, Dr. Karen Murchie, Shedd's migratory fishes biologist and the director of the freshwater research program. I'm going to turn the mic over to Austin, who's going to kick us off with a discussion on urban waterways.
Hi, thanks, Karen. Is everyone seeing the slides, or? There we go. Awesome. So as Karen said, my name's Austin Happel. I run a research program focused on urban freshwater systems, specifically urban waterways, as we have water flowing directly through most of our cities. My research program really focuses on how we can better understand these urban water systems. And it's really important as the global population continues to grow. It's actually growing faster in urban areas. And so if we're going to continue to have super dense urban centers, it's going to be important for us to understand the ecosystems flowing through them if we're going to manage, rehabilitate, and conserve freshwater fish populations. So I wanted to give you a little visual of what I mean when I talk about urban waterways and urban freshwater systems. If you look on the left image, that's one that you might think of if I ask you to think of a natural river or a natural stream. The one on the right, though, is the waterways or the Chicago River that flows through downtown Chicago. You can see the iconic bridges there. So I want you to just take a few seconds to kind of look at these images and see what differences you can figure out or what differences you see that stand out to you. So I'll give you, I don't know, I'll count to 5 in my own mind. So to me, the first thing I see is a lot of green on the left. That green can be in the form of either a canopy, something that's shading the river, or vegetated banks, or we call them riparian areas. That vegetation can actually suck up nutrients and pollutants from the waterway, and it can actually give back beneficial nutrients in the form of leaves that fall into the water, or sticks or twigs, or when the whole tree falls over, not only does it provide the same nutrients, but it provides shelter and habitat for fish. That's completely missing in the image on the right, and that image on the right is pretty ubiquitous across many cities across the globe. Another thing you'll notice in the image on the right is that the sides of that river are super distinct. They're almost cut down, and in fact, it is cut down and supported by steel walls. Those walls keep the river in place, versus the more natural river tends to actually meander and move, and they carve out sections of the landscape. When it's able to do that, it kicks up nutrients that can fuel the food web. In cities, we've stopped it from doing that so we can build buildings. It would be pretty bad if the river moved and swallowed up a building. So we've walled it off, but what that does is prevent it from picking up and fueling its own food web. Instead, our urban waterways tend to interact with wastewater and stormwater runoff, and tends to be pretty confined to just the areas that we've allowed it to go down. Something a lot of people don't know is within urban waterways, we actually manage them for transportation. And so we completely scour them clear of large boulders, downed trees, and all these other things that fish would consider habitat. And so they're pretty habitat poor areas compared to a natural system. If you squint really closely in the image on the left, you'll see people kayaking, which is also not something we see a lot in downtown areas. Instead, people usually interact with the river by driving over it or walking over a bridge or being beside it rather than being directly in it. So if we go to the next slide, I really want to highlight how cool it is to do this research within Chicago, because Chicago's waterways actually represent probably the most extreme version of an urbanized stream or river And so I'll call them a waterway because they don't really operate like a river at all. The image on the left is what the Chicago area looked like when it was first settled. We actually settled Chicago at the crux of where that word Chicago Rivers is. And that river flowed through the city and out into Lake Michigan. As the city expanded down towards the Calumet River and over towards the Des Plaines River, we used the river more and more for removing waste from our city, and that put it out into Lake Michigan. We had the smart idea to also build our water intake in Lake Michigan, so kind of conflicting interests there. And several large rain events caused sewage to actually flow out towards the water intake cribs, threatening our drinking water. So at the turn of the century, they decided to carve through the Continental Divide and allow these rivers to flow down through Illinois and out through the Mississippi. And what that does is it sucks water in from Lake Michigan, flushing our city clean of any of the stormwater runoff or wastewater runoff, and puts that water down through Illinois and out to the Gulf. And so the headwaters of our waterway system is actually wastewater treatment plants in Lake Michigan, whereas headwaters of a normal river are up in the mountains and up in river systems, and those areas can actually pull and provide nutrients further down. So we're not even sure what the base of the food web really is in these waterway systems, and so we're looking to kind of look into that and try to figure out how these operate as an ecosystem. We go to the next slide. So my research program really kind of focuses on 4 areas, or I want to highlight 4 areas that I'm interested in for you all here. The first one being habitat enhancements. I've discussed quite a bit about how we scour the area clear and how there's not really riparian areas. Well, several different organizations are seeking to put those back in. And so I'm trying to help assess how potent those benefits are, or what benefits they do provide. There's thousands of community members or citizens for every biologist, and each one of those community members tends to have a smartphone. These smartphones now have super great cameras and great GPS capabilities. And so I'm working to kind of leverage those to turn community members into stronger citizen scientists or community scientists. How can we get information on fish throughout our urban areas through the use of all these community members interacting with the world around them? I do my own field work, which involves monitoring for larval fish. For every adult fish, there's thousands and thousands of babies. So where we can find those babies, it's actually a little easier than finding an adult one. And where we can find those larval fish or baby fish can tell us quite a bit about what species are in the area and whether they're finding habitat they enjoy or not. And then I leverage a lot of partnerships to turn big data sets into stories that make sense to people and try to get people engaged in the environment around them. So the next slide will show us a little bit about some of these habitat enhancements. This is an image, a promotional image of the Wild Mile project, which is being built on the east side of Goose Island in Chicago. This project seeks to put a floating mile-long eco park in the river and try to get people to connect more with the river as an actual ecological resource rather than simply something that transports boats up and down. So these this floating eco park is actually made out of floating wetlands, which are giant mats of native wetland plants. And these plants are really good at sucking up nutrients. And I'm helping to look at what sort of habitat do these provide for fish? Do fish spawn on these floating wetlands? Are they hiding out underneath them more than they are elsewhere in the waterway? If you go to the next one. Like I mentioned, I'm really interested in how can we sort of leverage all the people around us to get data on the animals around us. One thing that Shedd's promoting is an app called Great Lakes Fish Finder. Well, it doesn't really find fish for you. We're hoping you can help us find fish. This app allows you to take a photo of any fish that you see. It helps you identify what that fish species is and give you some information on its ecology and life history. And then we can use that data to try to map out when and where fish species are being found. And I wanted to use some of this data as a way to show that these community science apps can actually provide interesting novel research avenues. So I went through, if you go to the next slide while I talk, I went through a lot of the observations that people put on iNaturalist. iNaturalist is sort of a data hub for a bunch of different projects, and Great Lakes Fish Finder is a project within iNaturalist. And the whole goal of the iNaturalist project is to get people to interact with organisms around them. So they post photos of fish onto this app. I went through and looked at thousands of individual fish photos and quantified whether they had symptoms of a disease called black spot or not. Black spot is simply a small parasite that appears on fish that looks like they've been sprinkled with black pepper. It's relatively benign, and so research on this parasite has not really been funded well. And so this provided an opportunity to actually look at a continental-wide view of where are fish exhibiting more or less of these symptoms. And we were able to actually use the citizen science platform to provide a geographic map of where more fish have black spot disease and where fish tend to not have it, which was really cool. And we're hoping now to kind of look into what is causing that, or maybe we can have other people start looking into other really cool questions that can come out of these photographs. I also said I do a lot of field work. My field work is actually at night, so I'll go out at night on the Chicago River and look for larval fish. To do this, we put out a trap that has a glow stick in it. So if you're ever walking around the Wild Mile area or some of the local parks on the river and see a green orb floating in the river, that's actually one of my traps. The glow stick attracts larval fish into it, much like a moth is attracted to a flame. And then an hour later, I can go and pick it up and see what fish are in that area. So far, we found about 11 different species spawning within the area of the Wild Mile project. A lot of those species are native fish, things like bluegill, white sucker, several different shiner species, gizzard shad. And we've also found a few invasive species, things like round goby goldfish and common carp, which are things a lot of people have heard of. And now we're trying to relate, where do we find these species and what is the habitat around that area that leads to fish spawning in certain parts of the river and not other parts of the river. Another thing I work with is partnerships. There's a lot of other people that are collecting a lot of data, and how can we turn that data into stories that matter to people? And so in 2020, I was actually working with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. They're our manager of stormwater and sewage water. They do fish surveys every year. And I was able to work with them to look at their long-term data sets and look at what fish species they find throughout the past 35 years or so. And how does that compare on average across those years? What changes and trends do we see? And when we sort of average across all the sites that they sample, we were able to see that on average in the late 80s, they found around 5 to 6 species of fish, and now they find somewhere close to 13, 14 species of fish. And so that's really a tripling in the number of fish species found in the waterway. And these tend to be native species that are returning to the waterway. They're not really invasive species that people are dumping in. We're not really finding more and more invasive species in the area. So seeing increases in native species, these are species we usually think of as being pretty picky in what water quality and habitat spawn on. So seeing them come back to the system really speaks, great, we're treating the system now compared to used to treat it. Coming back speaks highly to how we should continue to kind of conserve this resource within our downtown area. And so if we go to the final slide, sort of the take home I like to tell people is that the waterways flowing through these urban systems are living systems. They're living ecosystems. They have a great diversity of fish species and invertebrate species in them. And we can actually reconcile the needs of humans with those of that ecosystem. And when we're able to kind of cohabitat the same area, it benefits everyone around us. Healthier, strong functioning ecosystems can actually promote human health in that area. So my program seeks to find a future where urban centers actually utilize, celebrate, and care for the ecosystems in their backyard. And this is an image from the Portland area where they've turned their also somewhat polluted river into a great source that's clean enough now that they can get into it and actually host floating concerts. So hopefully in the future we can do similar things in Chicago, and I just think that that would be such a great recreational resource for us here. And so I'll hand off the mic to our next speaker.
So I'm going to take you away from Chicago River and the developed waterways and move you into some of the other tributaries around the Great Lakes. And I think when you think of Great Lakes, what are one of the things that you think of living there? Probably most people would say the fishes. And absolutely, that is, you know, one of the top things that draws people to this area is to come and check out the fishes, whether angling or to try eating them. But fishes, like a lot of animals, they don't tend to live their whole life in one location, but a lot of them migrate. And within the Great Lakes, there's over 50 species of fish that move. And most often that's so they can find the most ideal habitat to reproduce in. And with this many different species of migratory fishes in the Great Lakes, you might think, what are some of the challenges that they face? Like certainly Austin covered in urban areas that there's a lot of development. So you could think of challenges in finding habitat for reproduction. But a very common one is barriers for migration. And a lot of the times when we think of barriers, we're like, oh yeah, dams. Big hydroelectric dams blocking fish passage on large rivers. They're trying to get upstream and they hit this dam and they can't go anywhere. Well, those definitely are barriers, but dams are not nearly as numerous of a barrier compared to things like culverts. And culverts and other smaller barriers, actually, there's around 275,000 barriers like culverts around the Great Lakes region that could stop fish from being able to get further upstream. So this is something that is a real challenge. And you may be surprised to know that only 13% of all of the streams around Lake Michigan are unblocked by some sort of barriers. Again, culverts being the most common culprit. So migratory fishes not only face the challenge of being able to, trying to get to where they want to go and sometimes running into barriers, but climate change can also affect fish migrations. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the next few slides. But I really want to hit on, like, why should we care about migratory fishes? And there's a lot of reasons. To start out with, like I mentioned, fish most often migrate to be able to find places to reproduce. So they're changing their habitats, most of them moving from the main lake basin into a tributary like a river or a creek, or sometimes in a wetland, to be able to find suitable spawning habitat. And reproduction is important for us to be able to have the fish population sustained. So we can keep having those fish that are out there for commercial and recreational enjoyment. Something that you might not know as well is when animals move, like fishes, they connect the habitats that they move from. So they might be dining in one area and then defecating in other areas, and that moves that nutrients around, and that can be really important, particularly after a long winter, when there might not be a lot of nutrients that have come into local waterways like tributaries. And actually the movement of the fishes can basically act like, they could be like little gardeners fertilizing these tributaries. So the movement's ecologically important for being able to reproduce and sustain populations, but also, again, that habitat connectivity and nutrient movements. Also, migratory fishes have a tremendous economical and cultural significance in the Great Lakes region. The value of the fisheries for all of the different aspects for commercial, recreational, and tribal fisheries It's valued at more than 7 billion annually. And these commercial, recreational, and tribal fisheries support more than 75,000 jobs. That's a really big deal in the Great Lakes area. It's estimated around 1.8 million people come to the Great Lakes in a year just for recreational fishing opportunities. That's a really big draw. And you can start to think of how that goes out into the community in terms of that ripple effect. People coming to an area, staying at a hotel, going and eating in restaurants, and sometimes hiring guides or renting boats to go out onto the lake. That's a really big deal. And from cultural significance too, there's a lot of mascots and festivals that are related to the fishes that are in the Great Lakes. And even though some of the migratory fishes may not be recreational species, like I'm going to be talking about in a moment, a lot of them still are contributing to that overall food web that supports recreational and commercial fisheries. So the main species that I'm focused on for the migratory fishes program are suckers. And the main species that are super abundant in the Great Lakes are white suckers and long-nosed suckers. And they're probably the most abundant migratory fish species in the Great Lakes as a whole. And they make spring spawning migrations, moving from the main lake basins. They're found in all 5 of the Great Lakes, and they move into tributaries large and small to reproduce. And this happens not long after ice is off, and they're coming into the tributaries after there's been a real void in nutrients, and their spawning activity adds nutrients that way. And actually, it's been found that through their active spawning, they're contributing nutrients that get taken up by the algae. They found that caddisfly larva, a little aquatic insect larva, you get large hatches of the adult insects later on in the year. The caddisfly larvae grow 12% larger where the suckers are found. They're coming in there and they're adding all this nutrients, which is really great. But something, even though they've got this amazing ecological significance, we really don't know that much about them from a biology standpoint. They are not fish species that have great recreational value. There's not a lot of people going out to angle for them. They don't have a huge commercial fisheries value for people dining on them. But that ecological significance is major. And as, like I said, one of the largest, most abundant migratory fishes in the Great Lakes, it's really key to understand more about sucker migrations and the challenges that they face. So through Shedd's Migratory Fishes program, we're looking at understanding the biology and ecology of these fishes in a number of ways. So from putting transmitters into the fish to be able to understand, do the same adult suckers come back to the same location year after year? Do they encounter challenges that allow them or not allow them to be able to get upstream to spawn? So that's something I'll talk about in a minute and get into greater detail. We also have a community science program. Like Austin said, there's way more non-scientists living around the Great Lakes than there are scientists. So we can really use that power of numbers to be able to help us collect data. So indeed, that's what we're doing, getting some eyes out on the creek to monitor when the suckers show up to the different tributaries for spawning and how long their spawning activity lasts. And all of this information is really important. We can think about using that data to inform conservation management strategies along with habitat restoration. So if you have a tributary with a culvert that is blocking fish migration, having the data there to say, yeah, fish are using this tributary in the spring and they can't get to where they want to go, then that makes it a good candidate to be able to replace a culvert with something that is passable. So basically, to do the tagging and tracking, can put these little tiny tags that are a little bit bigger than a grain of rice into the fish. It's the same type of technology if you have a microchip dog or cat at home. These tiny little transponders just turn on when they pass over a reader. There's a little electromagnetic switch that allows the information to be picked up, and an individual ID is recorded. You can see under this little footbridge in the image on the screen, there's a 2-foot square antenna. And then in the middle picture, you've got an underwater view of a bunch of adult white suckers hanging out by an antenna. And some of them are tagged. And right there, that allows that information. Basically, the fish are checking themselves into this tributary as they swim in and pass a bunch of antennas that say, oh, yep, fish number 123 was here at this date and time. And we can log the returns of the fish year after year. And when I talk about culverts, here's an opportunity to see what I'm talking about if you weren't sure what a culvert was. Basically, wherever you have a smaller waterway where you're not going to put a bridge over it to allow vehicles to pass over, small things like streams and creeks, we usually have culverts. And often they're corrugated steel, but sometimes they're large box culverts that are made of concrete. That are more often used under something like a 4-lane highway. But these corrugated steel culverts are very common. And in this particular picture on the far right of your screen, you can see there's 2 side by side that allow, in a residential area, water to flow under the roadway that allows this stream to be able to be connected to Lake Michigan. But what can happen and why the culverts can be a problem then is in the springtime when you have a big melt of water or you get a large rain event, you can get some scouring downstream as this water is rushing at a higher velocity, and it can start scouring away at the substrate and start to make a waterfall. And if you're not a high-powered swimming fish like a trout or a salmon that has a super forked tail, you might not be able to make that leap up into the culvert and keep going upstream. So yeah, these are the things that we're looking at. Who comes back to the same creek year after year? Can they get through the various gauntlet of culverts that they face to get upstream? And so in 2017, I tagged 100 adult white suckers with these pit tags, and I was curious, am I going to see any of them again in 2018? And it turns out, yes, 50 of the fish had come back. And at the same time, I added an additional 200 tagged white suckers to the mix. And you can guess then to yourself, maybe write it down on a piece of paper and see how close you get to the guess. But in 2019 then, out of the 300 tagged suckers, we had 204 fish return back to that same tributary to spawn. And then in 2020, even though it was a little bit of a different year with COVID, I was still able to go set up the autonomous equipment so it could log the fish's information while I was sitting here comfortably in Chicago. And we had 176 of the 300 fish come back. Again, now this is 4th year of returning to the same tributary to spawn for a lot of the fishes. So very cool stuff. Look forward to seeing what other data we get. And I also mentioned that we really harness the power of community scientists to help document fish migration timing. And this is important in light of climate change. So as we might see warmer temperatures showing up sooner in the springtime, this could cue the fish to start migrating earlier than normal. And why that matters, in particular, I mentioned that the suckers are bringing a lot of nutrients into the tributaries when they spawn. And if they start showing up a week or so before the algae and the aquatic insect larvae are ready for those nutrients that they're going to provide, that could cause some cascades in the food web. So All these yellow pins that you can see along the western shore of Lake Michigan and a few pins on the south shore of Lake Superior is where we have volunteers going to a tributary that's close to their home or their workplace where they can get to easily every day. And they take a peek in the creek or the river starting close to the end of March, mid-March, end of March, and they watch to see when the suckers show up, and they take notes of when they see the fish and when they're not there, and also some environmental data. And this is something that has been a really great opportunity to get data. I can't be in all those places at the same time, but the community scientists do a great job of collecting that information. And then on top of it, we have these fantastic ambassadors that are out there. Usually when somebody walks by and they see somebody staring into a creek or river, you can't help but ask, hey, what are you looking at? So that gives the community scientists a great opportunity to be able to say, well, I'm looking for sucker migrations. And then somebody would be like, well, what's a sucker? Or why are you looking to see if they're migrating? And all of a sudden you have these ambassadors sharing all this important information. So it's really cool. Every year since we've been doing the program, starting in 2017, we've documented more than 10,000 fish each year. We've got a variety of habitats from urban rivers like in Milwaukee and that to ravine creeks in Highland Park, up to really pristine protected areas up in like Door County, Wisconsin. So it's really great. And a lot of times people think of, community scientists adding to animal migration data. You think of like birds and butterflies and so on. But this has been really a great opportunity to connect people with monitoring fish migrations. And certainly it has been really helpful for the Park District of Highland Park. They had done a habitat restoration in one of the ravine creeks, and they were excited to participate in the sucker monitoring. And sure enough, the suckers showed up after they replaced an impassable barrier. All of a sudden, the fish were coming. And we've been able to get a lot of press in local newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, getting good coverage throughout all the areas that not only celebrate the research that's happening, but also the community engagement, which is super exciting. And I had a picture, the previous slide, of somebody's cross-country skis sitting in the snow at one of the culvert. That just showed like how dedicated volunteers are to be going out and collecting that data. Rain or shine or heavy snowfall, people are really into it. So I'll leave you with a few take-home messages before I turn it over to Ken, our freshwater mussels specialist. But fish migrations are so important in the Great Lakes to be able to sustain the populations. And we need to think about when we're installing culverts that they have to be passable by all native fish species, not just the great swimmers like the trout and salmon. And climate change really does have the potential to shift migration timing, and we don't really know the full extent of the impact that may have. So this is why the community science aspect is really key. And with that, I'll let Ken talk about the freshwater mussel program.
Thank you, Karen. My name is Kentaro Inoue. I'm a research biologist focusing on freshwater mussel conservation. So in the next few minutes, I want to share with you about our freshwater mussel conservation research program at Shedd Aquarium. I think freshwater mussels are one of the underrepresented group of animals, and then most of people don't know their existence in the ecosystems, but they can be found in your backyard, rivers and streams. They are quietly burrowing into sediment and doing mussel things. So I will give you a little introduction to freshwater mussels and the ongoing conservation research at Shedd Aquarium. And I hope you learn a little bit about freshwater mussels and why Shedd Aquarium cares about these critters. Next slide, please. So those of you who don't know freshwater mussels or have never seen them, these are freshwater mussels. So they are native mussels living in streams and rivers, and then some in the pond and lakes. So they looks like marine clams, and then that's right, freshwater mussels and marine clams belongs to the same group of animal called bivalves. They split out a long time ago, and they form a unique group of bivalves. So invasive zebra mussels and quagga mussels are also bivalves, but they are very distantly related to freshwater mussels native to this region. There are about 900 plus freshwater mussel species in the world. And in the United States, we have about 300 species, and this makes one of the highest diversity in the world. They also provide essential function in the ecosystem. However, many species are on the verge of extinction due to rapidly changing environment, and I'm going to cover this later slides. Next slide, please. So this is very simplified version of what freshwater mussels do in the ecosystems. So they are filter feeders, which means they feed on microorganisms such as bacteria, planktons, and algae by filtering water. And by doing so, mussels are filtering any particles floating in the water and removing them and cleaning water. Once they consume microorganisms, they release pee and poop, which are great nutrient readily available for other microbes. So this is called nutrient cycle. So mussels are part of a nutrient cycle in an ecosystem. Although mussels have hard shells to protect themselves, they are not immune to predators. So many fish, birds, and mammals eat mussels. And finally, their existence create physical structure in the river bottoms. So because they are burrowing in the river sediments, they actually stabilize river bottom. And even their dead shells create shelters for other aquatic organisms, such as little benthic fish and then other macroinvertebrates. So they are part of essential function in ecosystems, but also provide ecosystem services for human. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have about 300 species in North America, and we can find about 22 species in the Chicago area, including Des Plaines River, Fox River, and Calumet River basins. However, we used to have 34 species in our region. In fact, 65% of all species in the United States are threatened or endangered, and sadly, 10% of the species already became extinct in the last 100 years. So this makes freshwater mussels are one of the most endangered group of animals in the United States. So populations and species are disappearing due to habitat loss, water pollution, invasive species, disease, direct harvesting, and also climate change. So in Chicago and Great Lakes regions, we have also multiple unique threats to freshwater mussels, and these include high human population density, urbanization and industrialization, and also if you go outside of the cities, we have a vast majority of agricultural landscapes. These are not ideal conditions for freshwater mussels. So at the Shedd Aquarium, we conduct a holistic conservation research. Next slide, please. So we conduct holistic conservation research to understand the current condition of freshwater mussels in the Great Lakes region and use research findings to develop effective conservation methods. So our research include field research, where we survey for freshwater mussels around Chicago and Great Lakes region to understand what type of species are there and monitor mussel populations to understand the health of mussel communities. We also conduct genetic research where we focus on rare and threatened species and understand how genetic variation is distributed within species. And finally, we use these findings to make decisions on how to most effectively protect mussels and their habitats. So in the next few slides, I will give you two examples of ongoing mussel research project at Shedd around Chicago area. So one of field research project is mussel monitoring program. So in this program, we are annually monitoring mussels to understand their survival and how populations are growing or shrinking over time. So the goals of this program are to understand how mussel community composition and population dynamic of the species change over time, and how environmental factors such as climate, flood, and drought affect mussel survival. So we currently have 3 monitoring locations in the Chicago area. And as you can see in the map, these yellow circles are monitoring locations. So at each location, we designate 150 square meter of area. And within the area, we search for mussels, usually snorkeling or visually picking up mussels, and mark the all collected mussels with unique tags, such as Karen just talked about for the suckers project, so that we can track each individuals over time. So we conducted mussel surveys in 2019 in these sites and established monitoring locations in 2020. So far we have tagged over 600 individuals across 3 sites. And we will go back to the same location in this summer to conduct second year monitoring survey. So this is the field research, and in the lab, we conduct conservation research, conservation genetic research. So in this research, we study particular species of conservation concern. So the main goals of this genetic research are to understand how genetic variation is distributed within the species, and what happened to this variation as population size declines or population become isolated from each other. So for this, we are currently working on a mussel species called ellipse. So this species inhabits small to medium-sized rivers and streams in the Midwest. And one of the large populations can be actually found in Poplar Creek near Elgin in Cook County. So as you see in the map, that species distribution is rather scattered, and ellipse is not usually found in a big river such as Mississippi River, and in fact, big rivers may act as a physical barrier for this species to disperse, and because small rivers and streams are more prone to environmental changes such as flood and drought, but also habitat loss by human, many states list this species as threatened and endangered. The state of Illinois lists this species as species of greatest conservation needs. This species is also the priority species designated by Chicago Wilderness. So in this research, we studied to understand how genetic variation is distributed within this species ellipse, and find genetic diversity hotspots to prioritize the populations for conservation. So as you see in the map, we found that the ellipse has unique genetic signature at each population. And this information is particularly useful when we conduct additional research on such as propagation or captive breeding in order to maintain genetic diversity within the populations. So how Shedd Aquarium helps mussel conservation? So first off, we use Shedd unique platform to directly engage public and disseminate current conservation issues. We also have teen and college education programs and foster next generation scientists and naturalists. But honestly, we cannot do it alone. So we are closely working with many local and regional conservation partners, such as Forest Preserve District, state natural resources department, and universities to conduct science-based research and develop effective and efficient conservation for this highly imperiled group of animals. So Shedd Aquarium and the Mussel Research Program are advancing our understanding of mussels in the Great Lakes region. And we try to keep healthy mussel population in our backyard streams and rivers in the Chicago area, which ultimately maintain the healthy rivers for everyone. So with that, I will hand this to Melissa. She's going to talk us about the amphibian community in Chicago.
Right. Thank you all for joining us today. And so today I'll be talking about Shedd's role in protecting wetland habitats. So you can go back to the PowerPoint, please. And one of the reasons that it's so important to protect and restore urban wetlands is because wetlands around the globe are threatened. And in fact, in Illinois, over 90% of wetlands have been destroyed in the last 100 years. At the same time, the wetlands that remain are home to about 40% of the threatened species in Illinois. And so there really is a strong need to protect our remaining habitats. Next slide. So here's a picture of one of the wetlands Shedd is working at. And one of the reasons that these habitats have been destroyed is because they're sort of just have been historically considered trash habitats. One reason being mosquitoes. Next. And so many people may be aware that mosquitoes and black flies, horse flies, and lots of other biting flies all require wetlands to breed. And so people have fields and wetlands to try and get rid of these nuisance organisms, ignoring the fact that wetlands are actually biodiversity hotspots that are home to many animals, including things like dragonflies and amphibians and damselflies that feed on mosquitoes, as well as to lots of mammals and birds that feed on our amphibians and other insects. And so we have a whole food web here that sort of transcends the aquatic terrestrial borders. And so it's a really, really important sort of hotspots in urban centers, in rural centers, agricultural habitats that promote native biodiversity. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, a lot of these wetlands are degraded, one reason being invasive shrubs. I think, yes, thank you, Karen. There's a lot of the native invasive plants that are crowding out and reducing the quality of our wetland habitats are things like the glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, and bush honeysuckles. And so in these two pictures, a lot of this greenery that's sort of choking out these wetlands are in fact these invasive plants. Next slide. So at Shedd, I am working with the stewardship team to restore and monitor these habitats. So we engage with community members and we invite them to come out and volunteer with us to remove these invasive species from around our wetlands. And then we go out and we monitor. We want to detect sort of how is this restoration work benefiting the amphibians, the plants, the mammals that use these wetlands, call them home. And ultimately, we'll be taking all of this data to apply it to future management in other areas so we can have best practices that benefit the most number of species. So here's a map of our study area. And for this experiment, to test the effects of buckthorn removal on wetland communities, we have 6 target ponds. Next slide. And so we have 2 treatments. One of them, we're removing 50 meters of buckthorn. That's about 50 feet. And we're also removing 10 meters of buckthorn, which would be about 33 feet. And so this is testing about, does it matter how much buckthorn from around a pond is removed? And then we compare that to control ponds where we have not removed any buckthorn. Next slide. So today I'm going to be presenting the results of monitoring that we started last year. So I don't have a lot of hard facts about the benefits, but I do have lots of animal pictures to show everything that we're monitoring sort of 1 year post removal. So the first interest we have is, does this benefit amphibians? And so we're monitoring the whole amphibian life cycle. We start in the spring with audio recorders, where we record calling males to see, are frogs showing up at these ponds in the spring, and are they advertising and looking to lay eggs there? And so that bottom picture on the right is a spectrogram, so we can visualize each call signature for different species. So for example, chorus frogs and toads have very different calls. So we can identify the species based on the call type. And we look for egg masses to see, are these males being successful? Are ladies showing up to breed? And then in the summer, we go out and we survey for the tadpoles to see sort of is the whole life cycle being successful? Are we going from frog to tadpole to frog again? Next slide. So here are some of our preliminary results. And so in our 6 target ponds, we found 2 species of amphibians breeding in all of them, the boreal chorus frog and the American toad. And that green frog right there shows the pond that sort of had the highest density. There were hundreds of thousands of little toad tadpoles and chorus frogs in that pond. That's a pond that was clear to 15 meters, and it's really doing quite well. And all the other ponds had about the same abundances of tadpoles. Next slide. One thing that's really interesting to note is that we did some pre-cut surveys. So before we restored these habitats, we looked to see which species were there so we can compare it to after the buckthorn removal. And so these gold frogs show that at these 2 ponds, we actually have new frogs showing up. And so our restoration seems to be benefiting the amphibians. So at one pond, we had both species show up where they were not there before. At the other pond, we had 1 new species show up that was not there before our restoration efforts. So that's really exciting news to show that restoration does benefit our amphibians. Next slide. Across the creek, we have a nature preserve, and there we have higher diversity of amphibians. So we have tiger salamanders, tree frogs, green frogs, and bullfrogs are breeding in the ponds over there. And so we're really hopeful that by continuing to restore our wetlands, that we may be able to entice and provide new habitat for these other amphibians that are in the area. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our wetlands do not exist just for amphibians. We have a whole food web going on. And so another aspect that we're monitoring are the invertebrates that call these places home. So things like the top left corner is a beetle larva. We have an adult beetle in the middle there, a damselfly on the top right, and on the bottom we have a tiny, tiny baby dragonfly larvae. And so we sampled the these invertebrates using dip nets. Next slide. And so I don't have any hard data of comparing between our ponds yet. We're still processing our samples, but I can say we're finding lots and lots of invertebrates in these ponds. We have things like fingernail clams that are filter feeders. They're eating the algae and they're competing with our tadpoles for the algae resources. We have lots of midge larvae and cranefly larvae hanging out. And every other picture on there are the predators. These are all things that are eating our tadpoles. We've got back swimmers and water boatmen that eat tadpoles, damselflies and dragonflies eat tadpoles, and all the beetles and the beetle larvae that are great predators for our tadpoles. So having healthy tadpole populations, and we have healthy invertebrate populations. And so it's all kind of connected there. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go one back. Thank you. And then for our mammals, we've got camera traps out, and we're looking to see sort of which mammals are in these sites and are any of them predators for our frogs. And then just in general, we want to know, is animal behavior changing when we've removed buckthorn compared to sites where buckthorn is not removed? And so we're detecting lots and lots of deer. We had a fox show up for a few months. There are lots of squirrels. We have fox squirrels, which is in this picture. We also have gray squirrels and flying squirrels. And then we've got a few coyotes that roam around our sites and lots of raccoons. Next slide. So here's a figure showing just the last couple of months, sort of the activity level. So think about this as abundance, right? How many animals are showing up at each camera each night, averaged over our whole site. And so 10 there on the bottom would be October, November, December, and January. So the last 4 months of data. This is the species that we're seeing, right? So we're seeing coyote, deer, foxes, possums, rabbits, raccoons, gray squirrel, fox squirrels, and flying squirrels in our sites, where deer and raccoon are the most abundant. And we can look at each species individual to see, are there differences among the different sites? So in purple are our control ponds, and the blues and the teals are our cut ponds. And we see generally across the board, across all species, that their behavior isn't changing a lot among our treatments, the exception being deer and raccoon, where we are seeing many more deer and raccoon using the sites that are cleared. And so deer, we know, prefer sort of edge habitats where they can be out in the open to feed, but close to woods to hide from predators. So it makes sense that they're really enjoying our cleared sites. Then raccoons are great frog predators. So it's really interesting seeing that they are also preferring these open habitats. So perhaps we have sort of a higher food web going on. Next slide. And we're also doing some bird monitoring. Don't have that data yet, but we are catching birds on our camera traps. And so we have things like wood ducks and mallards and Canadian geese that are using our wetlands when they're wet. And then as they dry, we're seeing some predatory birds just in the forests. We've got screech owls and great horned owls, red-tailed hawks and Cooper hawks as well, just hanging out in our forest preserves, which is really awesome to see. So next slide. So to take home message from this is that our wetlands are biodiversity hotspots, even our wetlands here in Chicago and the urban areas, and these are home to a wide variety of animals. And our hope is that by creating healthier habitats, we can create healthy populations of wildlife, which ultimately benefits us and creates healthy people and healthy societies. Thank you. I'm going to pass it back to Karen to talk about actions that you can take with Shedd Aquarium to benefit our animals.
Thank you, Melissa. And yeah, if you can show the screen again, I'm just going to wrap up with a few different ways that you can get engaged with Shedd. As we mentioned, we're harnessing in all of our programs a lot of the potential of engaging the community. And Shedd Aquarium has an action team that's doing a lot of activities that you can get involved in. This map just shows a number of the locations where some of these activities happen. Everything from litter cleanups on beaches to the habitat restoration activities that Melissa was talking about, removing the invasive buckthorn species to be able to bring back amphibian populations to these forest preserves, as well as being able to go out to do some paddle and plants and introduce some plant species into the Chicago River again. So I know that Alex was going to provide some links for all of you attending today, but across the top, if you go to Shedd's website, you can find information on dates that are coming up where you can get out with the action team, and you can email actiondays@sheddaquarium.org if you're interested in participating in one of these restoration activities. And I've got some dates on the slide here for some upcoming events at Bob Manwood's, as well as Skokie Lagoons. So again, there's more information on Shedd's website, but if you're looking for a way to participate in some of the activities right now with this winter and soon to be spring timing, the habitat restoration and the forest preserves are the main activity right now. So you would go and work to remove the buckthorn. So that is one way of getting engaged. And as you can see, we've got some direct research programs linked to looking to see what the benefits are of removing those invasive species with the amphibian habitat restoration. Austin did a great job of introducing how we're using Shedd's Great Lakes Fish Finder app. But again, if you missed some of that, it's a project that Shedd developed nested under the iNaturalist platform, which is good to be used all around the world to collect sightings on all sorts of taxa, from birds to plants to bugs. But one real big gap in data collection was fishes. And this is why Shedd developed the Great Lakes Fish Finder app, was to really try to promote more people logging the sightings of fishes in the Great Lakes region. So it's available for free for either Apple or Android phones. You can search Great Lakes Fish Finder on either of those stores and download it. And Austin showed a great example of how scientists and fisheries managers can use that data to be able to understand more about our fish community. And just a plug again, on how helpful this is, there's way more non-scientists in this area than scientists. So people that are going to be more likely to discover an introduced species, that's like anglers. And so sharing this information or being able to look at where invasive species might spread to, or even thinking about changes in species distributions with shifts in climate, there's a lot of power that community scientists can play in sharing some really important information in the Great Lakes region. And before we get to our Q&A, I'll just give a plug. Shedd Aquarium is open. So if you want to come and visit us and connect with some of the wonders of the aquatic world, both at home in the Great Lakes, we've got a wonderful Great Lakes gallery, and you can see animals from all over the globe. Do please come check us out. You have to buy tickets online in advance, but all that information is on Shedd Aquarium's website. And with that, I think we're going to be turning it over to Q&A. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. So thank you, Karen, Austin, Ken, and Melissa for sharing your expertise on those really important topics. And I think it's great that we got to cover such a variety of animals and such a variety of different research programs that are all happening at once. It's really great to learn about conservation happening in our backyard, but also across the Great Lakes region. So we do have a good amount of questions that came in from the audience. So the first one you actually took care of, and someone wanted to know what's the best way for them to get involved in some of the conservation actions that Shedd is taking. And so we'll make sure to get the links in the chats, both on Facebook and YouTube. So wherever you're watching, if you're interested, you can help Shedd and take part in some conservation actions and become part of the solution for a lot of these animals. So this first question that I'll ask, and I'm not sure who the best one to ask it is, so if anyone has any expertise in this area or some thoughts, feel free to pop in. But how should Chicago manage the erosion of the lake shore to help promote biodiversity?
The first thing I think of is in the Great Lakes, we also have reefs, and building more of those sort of reefs would really help with slowing down some of the wave action and some of the currents in the waterway while promoting habitat for freshwater fishes. The reefs in the Great Lakes are generally composed out of boulders and large rocks, and all the little crevices within those rocks are where fish will hide and spawn. And so using some of that, I guess gaining inspiration from some of the current reefs that are in the Great Lakes and maybe using that to help with some of the wave action could help with erosion.
Yeah, I'll also add that for helping biodiversity terrestrially, a lot of it comes down to the plants. And so we need to plant native dune grasses in the lakeshore and wetland plants, and that will help control erosion and promote healthy habitat for our wildlife.
Those answers are both really great. So Austin, I know you mentioned the word reefs, and when we hear reefs, we usually think about coral reefs in the ocean. Are you able to just provide a little bit more context for everybody listening on what a freshwater reef is? And I know you mentioned a little bit of what they're made out of, but what those might look like.
Yeah, in the Great Lakes, they're really rock piles, but we'll call them reefs. They're not built in the same way that a coral reef is. So a coral reef is usually built off of kind of the skeleton structures built by corals. And the reefs in the Great Lakes tend to be leftover moraines from like glacial action. And again, moraines are generally just piles of rocks that have been moved somewhere. The reefs in the Great Lakes tend to be these long strings of these rock piles that water currents can actually and kind of keep clean. And we'll see that native species like lake trout and whitefish tend to spawn within these rockways to kind of protect their eggs from the actions of waves and also from predation. And so, yeah, they're a little bit different. I've always found it confusing that we use the same word when it's an entirely different sort of habitat. But yeah, if you hear people talking about reefs in the Great Lakes, it's generally big piles of boulders. They'll look quite a bit like the breakwaters we'll use to keep our harbors safe, just fully under the water.
Okay, that's great. And I think that's really helpful to differentiate the two. Just because I know coral reefs is such a common topic when we talk about the environment, but not necessarily freshwater reefs. And obviously they're important too. So our next question is for Ken. And someone's wondering, if mussels are so endangered, the freshwater mussels in the US, why aren't more people talking about them, or why don't we hear about them in the news?
That is a great question. Yeah, that's why I guess I'm presenting here. So yeah, I guess mussels are not really charismatic as other creatures. That's one big thing. What else? Yeah. Other endangered species could be like freshwater snails. That's also people don't know. So there are a lot of endangered species and groups are there, but we just don't know. So we need to talk about more.
Do you have any facts that people can take away that might make mussels feel a little bit more charismatic? I know some of them have some pretty good names.
Yeah. So if you go walk around the shore of like rivers, you can find a lot of dead shells if mussels are there, and then you can just pick up, and then you can use iNaturalist app to post and then get the species name and common names. But a lot of freshwater mussels has very fun names, like monkey face, rabbit's foot. That's one of my favorite. Maple leaf, pimpleback, wallybacks. There are a lot of fun names. So maybe you can learn from whatever you can find in a river. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. I know I have a few funny names. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I remember learning them and getting a chuckle. So I think this next question was directed towards Austin, but I'm kind of going to find a way to expand it to the rest of the group. So it started as, what species would you be most excited to see in the Chicago River? But I think I'd like to hear from everyone. And in terms of your research, what would be the thing you're most excited to see? So we'll start with Austin, and then move to Karen, and then Melissa and Ken.
Yeah, so for species that aren't currently common in the Chicago River but would be exciting to see, I tend to just draw inspiration from the Des Plaines River because it's right next door. And so things that are within that river, which is a little bit more natural, it's one of the longest flowing rivers within northern Illinois. It tends to have quite a larger species diversity than the Chicago River. So it would be really cool if we could either get gar or northern pike to live within the Chicago River. They're top predators, and they're pretty picky about what sort of habitat they like. So they really like to see vegetation within the waterway, so aquatic vegetation, so things that are actually within the waterway. They'll tend to spawn up in the reeds or up in the leaves of things. So seeing them come back would speak to how we're treating the habitat of the area. But also the water quality. Being top predators, it takes quite a bit to get energy up into them and into their body cavities or into their body size. So seeing those top predators come back would be super cool. And then to give a small fish, if we found more central stone rollers within the waterway, that would speak to how much sort of like algae and periphyton, so things growing on rocks, how much of that is coming back into the system. So I'll give you kind of a top predator and sort of a, I don't want to say bottom feeder because that doesn't have a great connotation, but you know, a species that feeds at the bottom of the food chain.
That's great, thank you. And then Karen.
Austin's answer was really well-rounded. For me, just being able to see more of the native species coming back, as Austin showed in his presentation, we're seeing a lot more native species coming back to the Chicago River. So I think that just overall encompassing answers what I'd like to see as well. I think it's ultimately a great opportunity as people are engaging and using the waterways more for kayaking and other recreational activities like angling, people are paying more attention to like, hey, could I eat a fish from the Chicago River? And I would like to do that. So there's a lot of people, I think, too, that might underestimate how many folks are collecting fish from the Chicago River, the Great Lakes region to eat. And that is something that we want to be thinking about when we're looking at our water quality. We want people eating the fishes and feeling comfortable to do so. That's a win for everybody. So yeah, more native species back in the Chicago River. And like Austin said, some of the higher trophic level fishes like the predators.
Thank you for sharing. Melissa and Ken.
Yeah, it's going to be similar to Austin and Karen. I want to see the native mussels coming back to the Chicago River. So actually, we have some mussel species in North Branch Chicago River. I visited a couple months ago, and we found a few individuals over there. So we actually have mussels, but I want to see larger number and then larger diversity too.
Yeah, and then for the amphibians, spotted salamanders are really awesome, charismatic critters, and they're native to sort of southern Illinois, but also historically have been in Cook and Lake counties. And so I would just love to see us get some really healthy woodlands that could support those populations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think native species is a huge thing that we want to see. Obviously, in our hometown, we want the species that used to live there to still be prevalent there. And I know invasive species is a huge problem in the Great Lakes. Is there anyone who can speak to that in their work? How invasive species, I know we heard about buckthorn, but how invasive species are kind of outcompeting or changing the habitat for a native species? And if not, that's okay. Okay, well, we can move into the next question then. And I'll start with you, Austin, again, because it seems like it's directed towards you. What research would you like to see in the future on Chicago's waterways?
Yeah, some stuff I'm really interested in beyond. So like I mentioned, habitat enhancements and how we can maybe add habitat back into these working waterways. So something a little beyond that or more minutia of that is the idea that we might be able to do plantings of aquatic vegetation. So are we able to add beds of aquatic vegetation back into certain parts of the waterway that we don't really see it? I think that would be something that would be really interesting to see, essentially gardening underwater. And then I'm also really interested in some of these ideas where we can get live data and talk to people about them and interact with people. I don't know if people are aware of some of the websites where you can track where a shark is at any given time. I think it would be really awesome if I could show you a map of where certain largemouth bass are at any given time. Maybe that would just lead to people going directly to where that fish is and angling it out, and I haven't thought about it all the way through. But it would be super cool and a great outreach tool to be able to track in real time where certain fish are. And I guess those are two sort of topics that I think would be really cool to try to research in this area.
Yeah, I think it sounds like anytime you can get people involved in the research and get people invested in the animals that we're trying to conserve, that's a positive outcome. Karen, as you work in different waterways all up and down the west coast of Lake Michigan, is there any more research you'd like to see happening in those waterways that's not currently happening?
Well, I think it would be really interesting to be able to understand where the suckers go after they leave the tributaries. And this is something we're hoping to be able to expand the program, putting some fancier type electronic tags in the fishes and be able to track them as they move around Lake Michigan or Green Bay. I think that's something too that will provide a lot more information to fisheries managers and to ourselves to understand more about their biology and how shifts in climate could be impacting when they take their cues for knowing when it's time to migrate. So I think particularly for some of these understudied native species like suckers that haven't got the attention as much of the public because they're not ones that people go and fish for and are less commonly eaten by individuals. They are, again, playing such an important role in the ecosystem. So I think if we can do some more research to understand where they're living when they're not spawning and how much they're moving around there, that would be really important, because they could be providing an even larger ecological role to the Great Lakes than we realize. And even though they're common, we want to be able to keep them common. And I think that's something too, when we're talking about any of the projects in the Great Lakes, sometimes we only start to pay attention to species when their populations start declining, but we don't want to do that for species that are abundant right now. We want to be able to keep them that way. It's a lot harder to restore habitats and bring species back, and putting all those efforts in take a lot more time and money and resources than just taking good care of what we got and trying to keep our ecosystems healthy.
I think that's a great point. It's so important to keep things the way they are and try not to change the regime before it's too late. And then kind of Melissa, you already work with some of the more endangered species within the Great Lakes. What is some research you think that's missing that could help support the work that you do?
So from my end, Chicagoland has a really great network of green spaces with the forest preserves. And the forest preserve has a big initiative to restore thousands of acres. So I think it'd be really interesting to see how restoration affects the movement of animals between preserves, and if we can increase that movement and colonization of new habitats and the connectivity of all these habitats across the Chicago region.
Yeah, any research you think that's missing that might help support the current work that you're doing?
So about freshwater mussels, we still learning a lot about freshwater mussels, especially in the urban settings in Chicago. So we still understanding where those mussels are and how they are doing. So that's we need to focus on. And once we know where they are, we need to figure out how to manage those habitat and how to restore habitat to be the healthy mussel habitat.
So it seems like for a lot of these projects, it's just we need more research. We need more people who are interested and looking into some of the things that are affecting a lot of our local animals. And hopefully by inspiring the next generation of citizen scientists at least, or perhaps future scientists, we can get to that point where we have a robust research program happening for a lot of the species in our Great Lakes. So I think we have time probably for one more question before we have to wrap up. So I think we touched a little bit about it in a few of the answers, but how is climate change affecting the Great Lakes region as a whole and in some of our more specific smaller waters? If there's anyone who wants to tackle that as it affects your research.
Say, when we're thinking about fishes in the Great Lakes region, every aspect of their biology is controlled by temperature, from their metabolism to their movements. So temperature is such an important aspect in fish's life. And so if the water starts warming, everything's got sort of their range of temperatures that they can live in, and there's some ideal temperature ranges. So if water's warm a lot, we'll start to see species moving northward. But like I mentioned, from the migratory fishes aspect, temperature cues to say, hey, it's time to start moving for reproduction. That is something that we can potentially start to see a shift in. And it's not just from changes in when fish move, but also even things like when plants start leafing out. And Melissa's work really highlights it well. There's such a connection a tight connection between what happens on land and what happens in the water. So it's so tied together. We don't necessarily know all the impacts that could happen, but it's a tight relationship, and we'll certainly see some more extreme weather events, and those can certainly throw off things too. If you've got fish starting to migrate into a tributary, and then we've got all of a sudden a giant cold snap, what does that mean? Would they decide to stop the migration all around? Would they go and wait for the water temperatures to warm back up again and keep moving? There's so much to consider there. And I don't want to hog this whole question because I'm sure somebody else wants to weigh in.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in for a moment and talk more about, I mentioned timing of events being really important. And so amphibians, or pond-breeding amphibians, rely on how long a pond is wet for. So if a pond dries early, like in June, then that might mean all the tadpoles die before they can metamorphose and leave that pond. What we've seen is that even if we don't have changes in the amount of rain falling in a year, when that rain falls is really important. So if all the rain falls in March and April, and then it's a drought for May, June, and July, then our amphibians are not going to survive in these temporary ponds. And so as climate change sort of changes weather patterns, that can have really harsh consequences for our pond breeding amphibians.
Thank you both for sharing. Ken or Austin, did you want to add on?
Yeah, so with my research in the Chicago waterways, our waterways are actually tied to our wastewater treatment systems, which are both influenced from sewage drainage, so out of buildings and our houses, but also from road runoff. Both those get combined, they go to our wastewater treatment plant, and then after it's treated, the clean water gets put into the waterways. However, during large storm events, it can overwhelm the wastewater treatment plants and essentially flush them clean of how they operate. To avoid that, we have things called combined sewer overflows, which essentially takes the water that's running off of our roads and sidewalks, combines it with water coming out of our buildings, and dumps it directly into the river untreated. And again, those events happen when it rains really heavily. Climate change is predicting that Chicago is going to get about the same amount of rain, but get it in a much shorter period. And so we're going to have heavier and harder storms. You might notice that from last year, we had extreme rain events. And so what these can do is end up essentially putting raw sewage into our waterway. So I'll encourage people to help prevent that by looking into overflow action days. These are days that are promoted from the Friends of the Chicago River, and they're actions to kind of help reduce the amount of raw sewage that gets dumped into the river during heavy rain events. A second way people can help is to consider the amount of salt you're using during winter periods. All that salt eventually makes its way into the wastewater treatment plants and then into our waterways. And if you're using tons and tons and tons of salt, you're adding tons and tons and tons of salt to a freshwater body. And so that can really disrupt how the organisms operate. And so there's another initiative called Salt Smart, which helps educate people on how they can still use salt and still be safe in the winter by reducing the amount of ice on waterways, but also reduce the impact on our local waterways. So I'll leave people with kind of those two, which are overflow action days and Salt Smart initiatives.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I think it's helpful, especially right now with people needing to salt away all the snow that we've gotten in the past month or so. So we wanted to, thank everyone for tuning into today's program, Conservation Stories, which is a highlight of Shedd Aquarium's freshwater research. Wanted to thank our speakers today, Ken, Austin, Melissa, and Ken, for joining us and sharing their expertise and some really great ways for people to get involved in stewardship. We'd like to thank the Alvin H. Baum Foundation for supporting our environmental programming, Shedd Aquarium for promoting our programming, and Friends of the Chicago River for promoting our programming. If you enjoyed it, we'd love if you could fill out one of our evaluation surveys at c2st2.cnf.io, where we collected your questions today so that we can continue to put together programs that you find interesting and that meet your needs. And then please visit c2st.org in order to sign up for our newsletter or to donate to continue supporting our programming. Thank you so much to everyone who was involved today. We really appreciate your support.